Hey everyone, this is Ryan Chambers from Unique Perspectives. So I figured I'd make a video about all the different time periods from the medieval period to the present day. So as you can see from the first picture, the medieval period existed from around 476 CE to 1345. The Renaissance period started from around 1345 to 1685. The Enlightenment period started from about 1685 CE to 1815. The Romanticism period started from about 1815 to 1837. The Realism period started from about 1837 and ended around 1863. The Naturalism period started around 1863 and ended around 1890. The Modernist period started at about 1890 and ended around 1945. The Contemporary period started around 1945 and is going until the present and even the future. That's the period we're in right now. Now, in this video, I'll go in detail the different time periods and why I chose these very specific years. Now, most of the time when you learn about these periods in history, they're very vague and they might even round it out to the nearest century or decade, or have different years that they pick for when it ended based on different historian opinions and what they feel like were important events of each period. And that's not to say that these periods were not overlapping. These periods often overlapped. I just would prefer it though if they didn't overlap. Like if one period transitioned completely and instantly into the next period, but of course that's not exactly what happened. So these years aren't exactly accurate. But I based these timelines and these time periods off of. So let's look at the title: an approximate causative timeline from the medieval period to the present. So it's based on cause and effect. And when I looked up what was the first event of the, for example, Renaissance period and when was the last event, that's how I based, that's where I got these years from. Okay, so if you say they're not accurate, I based all mine off of facts, and of course there's different opinions on all these periods. Now with that said, let's go into it. You can feel free to verify all this with your own research and Google and everything, but here's a picture of the medieval period. So at around 476 CE, a Germanic prince named Odovacar, there's other ways of pronouncing or spelling his name, but that's him right there, and he basically was a Germanic prince, and he took control of Western Rome from Emperor Romulus Augustulus. So Romulus Augustulus is this person. Okay, so next picture. Here's what the Roman Empire looked like before and after that event. So as you can see in pink, I don't know why it's pink and purple, but it really should just be pink. That's what the Western Roman Empire looked like in 395 AD, or CE, you could call it. So that's in pink, and then in purple is what it looked like after that event in 476 AD. And then the Eastern Roman Empire is in yellow. Okay, next picture. Petrarch. I'm hoping I pronounce all these names right, by the way. Forgive me if I don't. Okay, so actually let me backtrack a little bit. So going back to a picture of the medieval period. The medieval period basically was an expansion of civilizations geographically and a development of trade network between civilizations. That was a big part of it. But also, there's a lot of advancements in military warfare. Weapons changed, shields, swords, different things. And that's not to say that the weaponry before then was inferior or hadn't been invented yet, but warfare had been changing a lot over time. So just because something is used in a later time period doesn't necessarily mean it's superior. It depends on the context of warfare. Now, the medieval period was also known as the Dark Ages because people say that not a lot was invented, or there wasn't as much literature and art as other periods. And while that might be true, there is possibly some bias to that, of what do you consider useful to you, or especially to historians that might call it the Dark Ages. So moving on from that, the end of the medieval period was around 1345 when this person, Petrarch, or Petrarch, might be the way you pronounce it. So he didn't really discover Cicero's letters, but he rediscovered them. And what does that mean? That means that let's go to the letter to Cicero. So he writes a letter to Cicero, and he also, this is Cicero right here. He basically takes a look at Cicero's letters that revealed his true self rather than his public persona. Okay, so that was the basis of what started the Renaissance period, is when he did that. Okay, and let's go over the Renaissance period. So the Renaissance period started around 1345, and it was a period of questioning. So questioning religion, and there were a lot of artistic changes, musical changes in literature, and increases in inventions. So there were a lot of famous people from this time period, people that invented a lot of things. Like, let's look at Leonardo da Vinci. He's one. Leonardo da Vinci came up with a lot of inventions, like the prototype for a tank and a lot of other things. And Mona Lisa, the famous painting. Thomas Hobbes is another one. He wrote the Leviathan, that book. Of course, there's Michelangelo and others. Charles, and now this is Charles V. And why is he mentioned? Because at about 1527 is where the unified historical period of Rome fell. And this was because this guy, Charles V, he was the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and sacked Renaissance Rome in, I believe, about 3 days. So they were no longer unified as a historical period, but many scholars say that the Renaissance period still went on for more than 100 years later and ended around 1685. Now, why 1685? Well, that brings us to the Enlightenment period, which starts around 1685. So that was when the Edict of Nantes was revoked by Louis the XIV. That would be, I think, the 14th. Okay, revokes the Edict of Nantes, and this leads to an exodus of Protestants from France. Now, this edict was replaced with the Edict of Fontaine Q or something like that, but it's spelled like Fontaine and then Bleau. Okay, I want to say blue, Fontainebleau. Okay, and what does all that even mean? It means that before Louis basically, before he replaced it with that edict, there was more freedom of religion, and that's why Protestants didn't need to flee, because they had freedom of religion and a lot more rights. But then he took those rights away, and that's why they fled. Now, this Enlightenment period, basically, the difference between the Enlightenment period and the Renaissance was pretty nuanced. So it placed more of an emphasis on math and science than the Renaissance, and it questioned religion much further than the Renaissance. Okay, I forgot to mention too, for the Renaissance period, you had Shakespeare. He was pretty well known, and his last work was around 1613. Okay, and then so here's Louis the 14th, and then here's a picture of the Edict of Nantes, and then it being replaced with the Edict of Fontainebleau. That's a picture of that. And then the reason, or what caused the Enlightenment to end, was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So this is Napoleon. Now that was around 1815, and even before this, you had a lot of famous people. So I'm going to backtrack and show. I'm going to show John Locke. He was famous for the idea of life, liberty, and property, which was later changed, I should say, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, and then Voltaire, he believed in freedom of religion, separation of church and state. See, a lot of these same ideals were put into either the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, these type of ideals that were coming out of Europe. Okay, and then George Washington, you may not see, that's the other misconception, is that all these periods, like the medieval period and all of that, was just in Europe, and Renaissance and Enlightenment. It didn't necessarily just describe Europe. It could be describing possibly the whole world, depending on the type of period. Okay, like the Enlightenment period was something you would study in U.S. history, and you wouldn't normally hear George Washington's name in the Enlightenment. You would probably hear more names like Thomas Paine, and the book about the common sense, I should say, where he wanted independence from Great Britain. But George Washington, he kind of wanted the same thing, but he led an army against Great Britain. Okay, and then so again, the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, which was after America became a country in around 1776. So we're at 1815 now. After the Napoleonic Wars ended and the Enlightenment ended, we go into Romanticism. Now, there are certain periods, I should say, that one could include instead of all the periods that I included, but I just chose to organize it this way. Okay, so some even say the Romanticism period started in 1798 with the lyrical ballads of with the lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So they talked about things such as the Dove Cottage, which is pretty famous, and being against railroads and other parts of industrialization. And it's a real place, I believe, in England, that Dove Cottage. Okay, but another example of the Romanticism era, or period I should say, you could say was Liberty Leading the People. That was a pretty famous painting by Eugene, I hope I'm saying the last name right, Delacroix, and that was in 1830. So this is a painting of basically a goddess who had a flag of France in one hand and a firearm in the other hand, and it commemorates Charles the 10th of France being overthrown, I believe, by the earlier French Revolution. Sorry, let me backtrack. I don't know if I said it already, but Romanticism, it was a backlash against Enlightenment, industrialization, and rationality, literature, etc., to focus more on emotion, individuality, imagination, etc. But a lot of these paintings were pure fantasy. For example, this one seemed to be pure fantasy. But some events of the Romanticism, well, I should say a lot of the art was fantasy, but there were events like the coronation of Queen Victoria, which led into the Victorian period, the Victorian era, and that kind of ended the Romanticism period. Okay, now this brings us into realism, the realism period. Here's a picture from the realism period. Even though some people, like I say that this period started sooner than 1837, that it started even as early as 1826, and here's a picture of that. So I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Le Mercure Francois du. I don't even want to pronounce the rest of it. But this basically was a French literary magazine that used to describe truthful depictions of nature and life rather than imitating past art. Okay, and then let me show you another picture of, I think his name is Gustave Courbet, who proclaimed and practiced the realist aesthetic. So this is the that's him, and then the painter's studio is this picture, which was made at around 1854 to 1855. And the realism period, going back to explain what the realism period was and why it followed the Romanticism period, is because it was an anti-establishment, non-conformist type of period where real descriptions of events, even ugly or controversial, were shown, which differed from the Romantic or other periods, because it was based on reality rather than fantasy. And photography became prevalent in the 1840s, and slowly but surely it started to make the realism period end. So at around 1863 we go into another period, which is the start of the naturalism period. So naturalism was to describe it, you could say it was the adaptation of principles and methods of natural science, especially Darwinian view of nature, to literature, art, etc. And it also illustrated the dominance of environmental conditions in human life and on individual characters. Okay, so in 1863, I believe this book is called, let me go to the book, Histoire de la littérature anglaise. I hope I'm saying it right, in French. So that was published in 1863 by Hippolyte Taine in France. And he attacked eclecticism. The idea of eclecticism is where you're able, or it's okay to take bits and pieces from a lot of different types of philosophies or ways of thought and kind of put them all together. He didn't agree with that. He thought you shouldn't pick and choose parts you like out of certain philosophers or philosophies. You should believe in all of it from each one instead of picking and choosing the parts you like. And he thought you should focus less on critical thought and more about historical causation and psychology. And this encouraged a preoccupation, among others, with an emphasis on biographies and literature history rather than critical judgment, which differed from before. And 1890 was, well, actually, let me go to Hippolyte Taine really quick. This is what he looked like. Now, on to William James. He came up with the book called The Principles of Psychology in 1890, and I'll go over what that was. He shifted the thought away from an association of ideas to a focus on central nervous system processes and brain stimuli. And this basically started the modernist period. So this is a picture of painting of the Synchromy in Orange by Morgan Russell from around 1913 and 1914. So the modernist period was basically about industrialization and rapid societal changes causing conflictions with traditional Victorian morality, optimism, and convention. New types of psychology, philosophy, and political theory emerged. So different sources say different things, and there's different kinds of modernist periods. For example, some say the modernist period actually ends as soon as 1920, but I kind of say it ends more around 1945 because that's where more of the sources say it ends. But it breaks up modernism, or it adds on to modernism by labeling it postmodernism, which started possibly around the 70s, and then postmodernism in the 1990s. But I don't want to organize it that way because I organized the contemporary period from 1945 to the present. And like I said, there may be overlap, but I would prefer to emphasize when periods were the most emphasized basically in history. It seemed like from the timelines that I gave. Now, it may overlap into other periods, but it's still, I think, should be organized the way I organized it, with the caveat that others think it went on until later or earlier years. But just to think about the cause and effect is important. So let's show another picture from the modernist period though. The Great Depression. So this happened around the 1929 to around 1940, I would say. And then World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. So this is a picture from World War II. So after World War II, we have the contemporary period. So the contemporary period started from around 1945 and ended until the present. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say it ended at the present. It's still going on, so it hasn't ended yet. But when I'm making this video, it's in 2022. Okay, so in the contemporary period, it's not over yet, so it's hard to categorize it, but it focuses on ideas such as postmodernism, which you could say started in the 70s or 60s, depending on what source you go with. And there's various governmental changes that occurred, such as the United Nations and the EU being formed. The Cold War is emphasized a lot in this period, and Israel versus Palestine, social changes against the old ways, space travel, etc. And some of these events or periods already either ended or they're still going. Like the Cold War, we would say isn't still going on, but other parts of the contemporary period are still possibly going on, like the Russia-Ukraine war. So let me show you a picture of art, postmodernism art. This is called pop art, and this was painted by Andy Warhol, and it's 4 different pictures of Marilyn Monroe. Now this is a picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969, and this is the last picture I have for this video, but there's been many events since then. Like I said, the Iraq War I haven't said yet, but the Iraq War, Russia-Ukraine War, etc. So I hope everyone liked the video. Feel free to subscribe, share the video. I will be trying to make some accounts like TikTok or Patreon or etc. And you might be able to donate to me soon for making videos like this. But I don't get paid anything for this until I get 1,000 subscribers, unless I get donations. So I'm mostly doing these types of videos because I feel like a lot of this information is not, maybe you can publicly get this information on the internet, but it's very difficult, and it's not organized in the way that I organized it either. So feel free to share the video. Thanks for watching. Bye.